Chair, before I continue with Mr. Glenn's evidence, you'll remember during the course of his evidence I asked you to stop the live feed and invited you to make a restriction order, which you were minded to do. Can I undo all of that? It was out of an abundance of caution. We're not going to invite you to make a final restriction order, and therefore there will be no redaction of the transcript or the live feed or the recording of these proceedings. I don't know if this is a spoof by Mr. O'Connor, but he's just told me that the live feed is not functioning momentarily, so I suspect I have to stand here and wait to be told that it's working again. Can we just check? Shall I wait? We're okay. We're okay. Thank you. Mr. Glenn, before I move on to ask you a few questions about the Operation Beach closing report, which you will have seen, can I ask you to turn back to your inquiry witness statement, which is behind the first tab, and go to paragraph 12. You were there talking about the, I think the Hilton Hotel incident where you were told that Mr. Diver had been seen speaking to the manager.
That's right.
And then in the last 4 lines, you say, I recall contacting the CIB, the Complaints Investigation Bureau, and speaking to someone there, raising my concerns about Mr. Diver's behaviour and activities, but being told that without very clear evidence, it was unlikely they could take anything further against a senior officer. Now, is that right? You did speak to CIB?
That's correct.
Was it in relation just to the Hilton Hotel incident?
Yes.
Did you mention the Cyril Smith investigation being shut down?
Not I can recall now.
So it was about Mr. Diver's personal behaviour?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. Now, right at the back of your bundle, you'll find the closing report for Operation Beach. And you'll have had an opportunity, I expect, of having read through this, Mr. Glenn.
That's correct.
Can we go to page 5 and put it up on the screen? IPC 000838. And you'll see, if you're at the right page, the name Richard Griffith.
That's correct.
Now, he was one of the sergeants that you mentioned originally in your statement, but you now think it was Sinclair.
Yeah, I couldn't remember, but I strongly suspect it was Sinclair.
Because if it was Mr. Griffin, or Sergeant Griffin as he was, as we see in paragraph 23, in the last 3 lines, he stated categorically that he had never been involved in any such investigation or surveillance involving Smith.
That's correct.
Going on to say that he'd not been aware at the time of any rumours or allegations involving him. He remembered you fondly as a colleague and a friend of whom he had immense respect, but he had nothing more to say by the look of it. Peter Lamb, if we scroll down to paragraph 26. Halfway down paragraph 26,
right.
specifically asked if he recalled a police investigation that involved surveillance on Smith or any investigation linked to a paedophile gang while he was based at West End Central, and he said he wasn't aware. Does that surprise you if he wasn't aware, if it was Malcolm Sinclair who was involved?
The nature of the operation, I think, was very covert.
Yeah.
And it certainly was not passed around the office.
And so would the information about it have been kept pretty tight?
Yes.
In other words, the people who were privy to what was going on,
That's correct.
that would have been kept tight.
Yeah.
And then we see other names at the foot of the page: David Biddle, Does that name mean anything to you?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And
David Biddle was an inspector.
would he have had any knowledge about this investigation? If you look at the foot of 29, if we can go to the top of the next page. Asked if he'd ever been engaged in any operations whilst at West End Central involving members of Parliament and corruption more specifically, or any MPS surveillance operations focusing on MPs, he confirmed he was not aware of any investigations concerning politicians or corruption.
He might not have been directly, but I've got a recollection of confiding in somebody as to what had happened.
Of your rank?
Yes, and speaking to my colleagues. Now, whether that was David Biddle, I can't remember.
Okay. What about David Stockley at paragraph 30? Does that name mean anything
Yes,
to you?
it does.
And what was his rank?
David Stockley was an inspector as well.
Paragraph 31. Asked if he remembered any investigations concerning prominent members of society, and more specifically Cyril Smith. Responded, didn't have any knowledge of any investigation run by the club's office regarding Smith or other prominent members of society. Again, would he necessarily have known if you hadn't confided in him?
No, he wouldn't.
And then there is someone by the name of Richard Whittington.
Yes.
Did you know him?
Yes, I know Richard Whittington.
And what was his rank?
Superintendent.
And would he have necessarily known of your operation?
Can't comment on that, I don't know.
Let's have a look at what he said at paragraph 34. Asked about his time in the club's office, specifically if he recorded an investigation into child abuse linked to Cyril Smith. Stated categorically he'd not worked on such an investigation or any investigation or inquiry that involved Smith, and he didn't know of any investigation, going over to the top of the next page, concerning Smith. But 35, he recalled working with you.
Yep.
Bob Glenn, do people know you as Bob?
Yes.
Working at NSY, New Scotland Yard, when attached to A21.
Yes, that's correct.
And then at the bottom of that same page, David Checkley, another inspector,
Yes.
said he knew you halfway down the paragraph 40, could have worked with you when posted to that division in around 1977, and described you as intelligent and articulate, but never worked together directly.
Yeah, I've got a strange feeling I'm going to add to that David Checkley, when I left Club's office, took over from me, because I recall David being in Club's office at some stage.
Well, as the inspector.
As the inspector, yeah.
But like the others, Mr. Checkley said he'd never dealt with and had no knowledge of any child abuse allegations regarding Smith or anyone else.
No, he wouldn't, no.
And then let's go to the next page, page 8. Now, do you remember I asked you about George Parry?
Yes.
You've been talking about a man called Tom Parry, and the first line of paragraph 42 says Glenn identified George Parry as the senior officer in charge of the club's office when Diver had returned to Vine Street. So have we been talking about the same men or two men?
It is the same man. I can't say definitely whether his name was George or Tom. I've got a funny feeling his name was Tom, actually. I don't know. But certainly his name, he was Chief Superintendent Parry.
Yeah. But he says in paragraph 43, he identified that club's office efforts were mostly directed at immoral earnings, pornography, monitoring casinos, late night clubs. Doesn't recall any mention of child abuse or any hints of corruption. And Perry said he was not at the club's office very long before he was relieved by Chief Superintendent Brian Sparks. Parry makes no mention of Glenn or Diver in his response.
No.
And Brian Sparks, did that name mean anything to you?
Yes, I know Brian Sparks. I knew Brian Sparks.
And is it right that Brian Sparks followed Parry into the office?
I don't know. I can't recall that.
But it appears, if we look at the last few lines of paragraph 45, from the information gathered, there's no suggestion that Sparks would have known about the matters referred to by Glenn. Glenn doesn't identify Sparks in any context, and based upon what's known, a decision was taken not to contact Sparks in this inquiry, and presumably that would be because either you didn't name him or he wasn't there during your time.
I knew Brian Sparks, the chief superintendent, but his involvement in clubs, I can't recall.
Yeah. Then there's a man called Dennis Lawrence. Does that name mean anything?
Yes. I seem to think it was Dennis Lorry as opposed to Dennis Lawrence, but
well, he identified as an officer who'd been posted to West End Central, attached to the club's office sometime between 1974 and 78. But it appears, looking at the last three lines, asked also if he recalled any suggestion that investigations were covered up or not proceeded with for corrupt purposes, responded he didn't recall anything of that nature.
that's correct, yeah.
And then we deal with the unnamed commander. And if we look perhaps at paragraph 49 and 50, he recalled that Smith was a well-known MP at the time, always in the media. He said that had such circumstances ever occurred, he would not have dealt with them in the, quote, cavalier way suggested by Glenn, unquote, and I'll come back to that in a moment. He was asked to speculate on such circumstances, and he said that in such a case, he would have advised the officer to return to his duties, telling him that he would take the matter further on the officer's behalf. Importantly, he said that as a commander, he would not have been in a position to take such a decision about an MP. He'd have taken the matter further up the chain of command, indicating it would have been dealt with at a very senior level, most certainly involving the commissioner and possibly a special branch. So the effect of what he says, if we just go back to 48, so on the previous page at the bottom,
See, if I could answer this, my consultation with the commander lasted, I think, 3 to 4 minutes. And basically what I wanted him to do was consult with the chief superintendent as to possibly why we've reached this situation.
No.
And he wouldn't do it.
No.
And basically, I remember distinctly basically saying it's something that you've got to sort out with the chief superintendent.
Well,
I wouldn't quite say he was washing his hands of it, but as good as damn it.
Well, if we look at what he had to say to Operation Beach all these years after, it's really the last two lines. He didn't recall you,
Yep.
and said he didn't recall being involved in or consulted on any allegations involving Cyril Smith.
Yep.
Do you think it's likely something somebody would forget?
I don't know. But certainly I take umbrage that he suggests the cavalier way.
Well, let's
It's
come
far
back.
from cavalier, I can assure you.
Well, let's come back to that, because if you look very carefully back at the paragraph in which it's quoted, 49,
Yep.
the sentence reads this way, or the report sentence reads this way. He said that had such circumstances ever occurred, he would not have dealt with them in the cavalier way suggested by Glenn. What appears to be suggested is that you're saying, I went to see him, he didn't want to get involved and suggested I go back to Diver and sort
Yes,
it out with
precisely.
him. And those are the circumstances, presumably, that this commander was saying to Operation Beach is not the way he would have dealt with the matter. In other words, that would have been cavalier, which leads to paragraph 50, when he was asked to speculate on those circumstances and how he would have acted. He would have advised, he says, you to return to your duties, that he would take the matter further on your behalf, and that as a commander he wouldn't have been in a position in any event to take such a decision about an MP, and would have taken it higher up to the Commissioner and or Special Branch. From your perspective, does that sound likely, or what that officer ought to have done?
That might be likely, but that's not what happened.
Yeah.
I can assure you, because I remember it. I remember speaking to him.
Mr. Mahaffey, a former temporary detective superintendent who has worked with the IOPC for many years, or the IPCC as it was, gave evidence to us yesterday. And when he was asked about these paragraphs, he said that his interpretation of what the commander was actually saying is to the effect of, we needed to think this through. And he also added, I think perhaps the commander's comments, he's thinking to himself, well, hang on a minute, you know, we need to find out a bit more about this, we need to understand fully what we are doing, that's all. Do you agree, from having read this, that is the effect, or was the effect, of what was going on between you and the commander?
I certainly would have liked that to have had that effect, but it didn't.
No. And looking at what the commander said to Beach in paragraph 50, he is suggesting to Beach, this is what I would have done if I had been approached with what Bob Glenn says I was approached with. And you have no doubt, you tell us, that you made this approach to him, that it was a short meeting, and he said what he said to you.
Yeah.
Did any part...
A very short meeting.
So, did any part of what he suggests he would have done in paragraph 50, had he been approached, did any part of what he says he would have done feature in the discussion you had?
No.
On the same page, Mr. Glenn, do you see under the heading additional allegations?
Yes.
This deals with the, first of all, the Hilton Park Lane Hotel issue in paragraph 51. And then at 52, Glenn referred to an additional allegation that Diver had been detained by security staff at the Regent Palace Hotel whilst trying to gain access with a male prostitute. Glenn said he received this information from an inspector at Vine Street Police Station by the name of Les Jones. Jones could not be identified in this inquiry. The receptionist at the hotel at the time of the incident was Caroline Parfitt, now, or nay, Turrell Harris, who happened to be, by the look of it, an ex-police officer. Turrell Harris was interviewed by the investigation team, statement made, and she recalled the circumstances described and remembered that a police warrant card had been produced. Unable, however, to identify Diver at any time as the suspect, and she recalled that some 12 months later, she was contacted by a DI Alistair McLean from Professional Standards, who'd asked her about the incident. She was unable to provide him with any further details. Now, on the assumption she was talking about all those years ago, does DI Alistair McLean from Professional Standards mean anything to you?
I know the name, but Professional Standards are, we were CIB, Professional Standards didn't exist when I was there. And
are you saying that there was no such department as Professional Standards? It was all under the head of CIB?
It was all under the head of CIB. It was CIB 1 to CIB 3.
And then paragraph 54, McLean was contacted. He confirmed he remembered Diver being a chief superintendent of Vine Street, recalled being told about an incident involving him at a hotel whilst in the company of a young black boy, said he'd not been involved in the incident could offer nothing more. And McLean referred to retired officer Anne McDade as a potential witness. She was clearly contacted, had no knowledge of the hotel incident. So we have a bizarre situation where the receptionist at the time, who didn't identify Diver herself but was actually involved, herself had been a former or became a former police officer, is not entirely clear. But according to her, a year later, she's contacted by an officer from professional standards, and when that officer is contacted, he says he knows nothing about it. I suppose you can't help us with any of that.
I can't, no. None. I mean, my last dealings with this was when I was in A21 at New Scotland Yard and having the conversation on the telephone, and that was the finish. I took no further part of it whatsoever.
If we go over the page, Mr. Glenn, to 55, but then a man by the name of Ian MacDonald makes contact with the Met regarding the incident at the hotel, and his statements obtained. It's not made clear how and why he made contact, but he did. And he identified that he knew Diver when Diver had been a superintendent at Battersea, so that's where he was shipped out.
Yeah, he went back to Battersea as chief superintendent.
Between 77 and 80, he was also aware that Terrell Harris had been a uniformed police constable at Battersea. He was aware that Terrell Harris had subsequently left the police service, took up a position as a receptionist at the Regent's Park Hotel. So by the time she's a receptionist...
Regent Palace Hotel.
Forgive me, Regent's, yes, quite right. It should be Regent's Palace, it reads Regent's Park. But the curiosity here is, not only had she, by the time she became a receptionist at that hotel, she had by then given up her occupation as a police officer, but she had worked at Battersea, which is where Diver went.
Went to as chief superintendent.
As chief superintendent.
Transferred.
Yeah. And he added, Mr. MacDonald, that although he had worked at Battersea at the same time as Diver and Terrell Harris, he didn't know either of them personally. But he recalled sometime between 77 and 87, while at Battersea, becoming aware of a rumour relating to Diver and Terrell Harris. Didn't recall how or from whom he first heard it, but his recollection of the rumour was that she had been working in the reception at the Regent's Palace, it should read, hotel, when Diver had attended, together with a Moroccan-looking rent boy, tried to secure a hotel room with a payment card, not checkbook, that didn't match the booking, and that the hotel security staff were called. Said he didn't know if police were called or whether there was any subsequent investigation. Said he didn't speak to Diver or Terrell Harris about the events. Concluded that he had no further knowledge of the events other than his belief that Diver had retired shortly after. And it looks as if a search was conducted on the DPS Tribune database to trace any records relating to Neil Diver's discipline records. None was found relating to him, and it said you couldn't provide any direct evidence of the circumstances described. The only former officer who actually witnessed the incident, and one similar to that described, was Caroline Parfitt, or Terrell Harris as she became known, and she didn't identify Diver as the officer at the hotel. And the other officers referred to couldn't corroborate the allegation to any meaningful degree. And because Les Jones couldn't be identified, a blank was clearly drawn. And so,
if I may come in there and say that clearly somebody knew about this, because he was transferred literally overnight. Now that does not normally happen. A chief superintendent normally has about a month's notice if you're going to be posted. He was posted overnight. And somebody must have been aware of that situation to actually, at a high level, to undertake this. There was no IO appointed, no investigating officer
when you
appointed.
say IO, investigating officer.
He was merely transferred. Now, from a CIB3 point of view, he would have, depending on the circumstances, been suspended, and a commander would be appointed as an IO. It would always be an officer one rank above.
Yeah. And if there had been disciplinary proceedings, do you expect you might have been called as a witness, or at least...
Certainly I wouldn't have been, because it's purely hearsay.
Yeah.
But whoever was the duty officer who actually went to the Regent Palace Hotel, and it may well have been a CID involvement as well, but whoever went to the Regent Palace Hotel would certainly be called as a witness.
Just remind us, Les Jones, who you remember telling you about this, did he say he'd actually gone there or just witnessed it on CCTV?
No, he'd gone there. He was the... It was on a... I recall, actually, because this was on a Monday afternoon. He'd been night duty officer that weekend because he'd come back on duty at 3 o'clock, and that's when he called me. It was on a Monday afternoon,
Yeah.
because he'd been night duty officer.
Yeah. And so we have the analysis of Operation Beach, which begins on page 12.
Yeah.
We can go to that. And I'm not going to go through it, but other than to look at paragraph 67 on page 13.
Yeah.
There's a clear conflict between the evidence provided by Glenn and that of the other officers who worked with or alongside him. Not one other officer recalls an investigation involving Cyril Smith. From the evidence of Parry, who'd been in charge of the clubs and vice office and also Whittington, it seems clear that the officers referred to by Glenn would not have been within the remit of the club's office. At that time, offences of sexual abuse would have been investigated by the local CID. What do you say about that?
My response to this is that, unfortunately, I couldn't remember who the officers were engaged.
Yeah.
I thought, I could only recall certain officers. And I think I mentioned earlier this morning that the officers actually involved were the Paul Holmes and the sergeant.
Yeah, Sinclair.
Sinclair, yeah.
So, in one sense, although you may have assisted Beach with all the names that you could remember, if none of them had any dealings with the operation, they weren't likely to know.
I do apologise, because
No.
I couldn't. It's been 40 years. I couldn't. I knew some of the names, but I couldn't remember everybody.
But in any event, what you told us is necessarily the information would have been kept tight.
Yes, it would have been.
No. The other thing I want to ask you about, though, is perhaps of a little more interest rather than just the names. It's the last bit of 67. According to the author of this report, it seems clear that the offences referred to by Glenn would not have been within the remit of the club's office. At that time, offences of sexual abuse, which is what Cyril Smith was effectively being investigated for, would have been investigated by the local CID. What's your take on that?
That wasn't the case. That wasn't the case. There was a tendency at times, I think, to use clubs' office as a bit of a dumping ground.
Yeah.
I mean, they specialised in vice within the West End. And whether this allegation involving Cyril Smith MP came in as a result of a complaint or some form of observations picked up by one of the teams, I don't know, I can't remember.
Yeah.
But certainly club's office were involved in an investigation, definitely.
So you understand they're saying the remit would have taken it outside the
No,
club's office?
it didn't. It didn't take it outside. It was investigated by officers from the club's office.
Well, I think that's all I've got to ask you, Mr. Glenn. I'll see if the chair and panel have any questions for you.
Yes, Ms. Sharpling.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. Just one question from me, if I may. You briefed the temporary chief superintendent about the Cyril Smith investigation towards its conclusion because you wanted a warrant for Mr. Smith's arrest
Yes.
in order to conduct an interview with him. Was there any reason why you couldn't have briefed the senior officer at an earlier stage of the investigation?
No, because it was policy within club's office to, as evidence built up, you assess the evidence to see how much more we needed before you took any action. as to whether or not a case was weak or there was strong evidence, whatever it may be. On this particular occasion, I can't recall exactly how much there was, but the evidence, as far as I was concerned, it seemed to me that the evidence was good enough to put before a magistrate to ask for a warrant for his arrest.
Yes, I understand that. I was really inquiring as to the timing of your briefing to the senior officer, why perhaps it couldn't be done at the beginning to alert the senior officers that this was a matter of some sensitivity.
Well, as far as Chief Superintendent Diver was concerned, he was there on a very temporary basis. It may well have been that when Chief Superintendent Parry had gone off to Hong Kong, you might not see a Chief Superintendent for days, and suddenly you'd get Mr. Diver appear, because he was the Chief Superintendent of Vine Street at the time, so he was running a division, but from a temporary point of view, he was also overseeing Club's office. So it might, I can't recall, but it might have been the earliest time I could have actually briefed him. I can't recall exactly how often I saw him before that.
All right, thank you.
We have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Wood.
Thank you very much for coming, Mr. Glenn. Thank you. Chair, the next witness is Paul Falston, who's already in the room.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Mr. Falston, your full name, please.
Paul Victor Falston.
Mr. Falston, you've made two witness statements, one a police statement in January 2015 and the other to this inquiry in January of this year. If you can find, please, your inquiry statement behind tab 1 and just look at paragraph 2, because I want to ask you, as I have others, just to help us give us a potted history of your time in the police force.
Yes.
So help us with when you started and where you finished.
Yes, I joined Thames Valley Police around 1971 after leaving the Merchant Navy as an officer, and I joined the Thames Valley Police, and after serving a probationary period, I applied to join CID and was appointed as a temporary detective constable to Slough Police Station.
And that was in 1975.
1975.
And you say that in 1977 you passed the detective training course, this at West Yorkshire Metropolitan Police Academy in Wakefield, and on your return you were appointed as substantive detective constable.
That is correct.
And you served at various Thames Valley police stations, is that right?
That's correct.
Eventually retiring in March 1988 on medical grounds.
That's correct. I had a serious police car accident.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you about events which we know through records actually took place on the 19th of May 1976. And from what you've just told us, you weren't a fully fledged detective constable in May 1976?
Correct.
What was your rank at the time?
I was a temporary detective constable.
Yeah. Okay. And so it wasn't until you'd done your training that you became a full-time detective constable?
Not until I passed the various qualifications in law that you got the correct mark.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you then about events on the 19th of May of 1976. At that time, were you involved in a murder investigation which had happened in the Thames Valley area, I think in Pangbourne?
Pangbourne on Thames.
And it was the murder of a man called Jack Wood. And on the day after the murder, were you and a detective sergeant, now deceased, by the name of Vallis, seconded to the murder incident room based at Pangbourne?
Correct, sir.
And were you given, you and Mr. Vallis, several actions to complete?
Yes, they referred to as trace, interview and eliminate various people that had been identified by the intelligence officer.
TIE, tracing.
Correct.
Yeah. And of the actions which you received, and one of the TIE actions, trace, interview and eliminate, did that relate to an inmate at a remand centre or a borstal, as it turned out, in Feltham?
Correct.
And on the day in question, I think you remembered, and I'm simply picking this up from a statement, the earlier of the two statements you made, the one in 2015, which, Mr. Forster, if you want to refresh your memory from it at any time, please do. But perhaps let's turn it up so that if we need it, we have it available. If you go behind divider 2 of your bundle, divider 2, you'll see a tab. Have you got it?
I have it.
Yep. And the chair and panel can turn it up as well if they wish. I'm on the second page, 2 of 6, or the inquiry reference number has got a page 3, but I'm looking at the internal pagination, page 2 of 6. And you go off, at the time you believed it was Ashford.
Yes.
I think there was a remand centre at Ashford at the time, but there has been a long-standing, what's now known as a young offenders institution.
Yes, yes. There
It was
was
probably a borstal in those days.
yes. I was incorrect in my, obviously due to the passage of time,
Yeah.
and also, whilst there'd been a uniform officer, I'd also escorted prisoners to both establishments.
Yeah.
So it was a lapse of memory.
No one's criticising Mr. Forston. But it's in Feltham, and you remembered having picked up Sergeant Vallis in a car, prior to which you had visited the incident room for a briefing to receive your actions that day.
Yes, the process was that at the briefing you discussed what had happened with the inquiry the day before, and then you were handed a number of actions to actually investigate during that coming day.
And this was one of the actions
And this
that
was
you
one of the
and Mr. Vallis were seeking to resolve.
Yes.
And so you arrive in the car park at the borstal, and you remembered, and this might take some of us of a certain vintage back, in a Hillman Avenger.
Absolutely correct.
The young people don't know what we're talking about, Mr. Forston, but it was a car that police drove in those days, presumably?
A small economical family saloon.
Yeah. And you remembered it was a bright, clear day. And let me take it then from your memory. I assume you still have a reasonable memory about all of this and what happened in the car park?
Absolutely clear.
Let's see how we go. What happened as you were in the car park, in the car, were you about to get out of the car?
We were sitting down discussing this action and going through it was the first opportunity we'd really had to read up on the background of the inmate that we're going to interview. So we were actually appraising ourselves as to what we were going to ask and just understanding some background on the person that we were about to interview.
Yeah. And let's be clear, as far as you were concerned, you were only interviewing this inmate about his whereabouts around the time of the murder.
Correct.
This is a huge question, Mr. Forson. Do you remember what the date of the murder was, or the date that you were interested in relation to when you saw him? You saw him on the 19th of May 1976, or at least the month in which it occurred? And if you,
not at this very moment,
All right.
no.
we may get a bit of a clue from a document I'll show you later. And as you sat there going through the papers, just as it were, familiarising yourself with the whole point of the interview, what happened?
We had something drew our attention, and I think now that it was a knock on the window, and I think it was on my side.
You were the driver?
I was the driver, yeah.
So you've got Mr. Vallis in the front passenger seat, you're in the driving seat.
Yeah, and there's a
tap
knock on the window.
And what happened?
There were two men dressed in suits, and they were obviously quite keen to talk to us. I can't remember whether they opened the window or opened the door, but a conversation took place where they introduced themselves as Metropolitan Police Special Branch officers.
Right. Did they show you any cards?
Yes, they did.
And did the warrant cards identify them as Metropolitan Police officers or Metropolitan Police Special Branch officers?
I'm unaware that there's any difference in the warrant card.
So they certainly had what looked to be legitimate cards.
Correct.
And what was the purpose of their being there?
They appeared to know the person that we were there to interview.
Right. And they clearly knew that you were there to interview him.
Absolutely.
And what did they say to you?
They advised us that to interview this person was not in the national interest.
And did they say why?
They didn't expand on it. They just said they prevailed on us that to interview the person wasn't in the national interest.
Right. And are those the words that were used, national interest, or?
I remember specifically it was national interest.
I just want to try and see if your memory is different to something you said a few years ago. Have a look at the second internal page of the statement, Mr. Folston. You see it says page 2 of 6.
Yes.
I'll ask you about their manner in a moment, but you see the capitalised words. They said, the Special Branch officer's manner was officious in their request, and we did tell them the name of the prisoner we were going to interview, whereupon they said interviewing that prisoner would not be in the public interest.
I'm incorrect.
No, you're correct and incorrect, and you'll see why in a moment, at which point Sergeant Andy Vallis became extremely angry and told them how dare they attempt to interfere in the investigation of a murder as it clearly had precedence over any national interest. So we've got two words, public and national interest. What word do you think they used?
I remember what stuck in my mind is national interest.
Yeah.
Because, and I think later on we discussed the reason that a public figure would be mentioned, and perhaps that's the reason for some confusion, that we're switching between national interest and a public figure.
But the effect of what was being said is that this was a matter of national security.
Correct.
Right. Now, in that statement you said that the officers, the Special Branch officers' manner was officious. Was it one or both of them doing the talking?
I believe one.
Yeah. A little earlier you said that they advised you not to interview. Advise is a rather perhaps neutral way of looking at it. Did you take it as advice, or was the tone a little more demanding than that?
We were being treated as a couple of provincial police officers and effectively being spoken down to.
Right. Now, did they ever tell you what the national interest was in not interviewing this inmate?
Absolutely not.
Did they ever indicate any subject matter which might arise if you interviewed this inmate that was a matter of national security or national interest?
Not at all.
So that was the conversation. You're not to interview him, it's a matter of national interest.
That's correct.
We can tell from what you said in the 2015 witness statement that Mr. Vallis became angry. What decision did you make?
Andy Vallis made it perfectly clear that they were not going to prevent us carrying out the interview, but I think we agreed at some sort of compromise that we would restrict our questioning to our interview regarding the murder and nothing further.
Right. And was that a compromise the Special Branch officers were willing to accept?
Yes, we carried out the interview, so they conceded on that basis.
But there's an oddity about this in one sense, Mr. Forster, isn't there? Because if they'd never turned up, you would never have known that there was any issue, and you'd have carried on asking the same questions that you compromised with the Special Branch officers you'd ask anyway.
No, absolutely.
So there was no real point to it in one sense.
No, I have to agree with you.
Yeah.
We were taken completely by surprise by what happened.
Fast forwarding just for a moment, because I want to ask you about this, but I don't have to dwell on it too much. Years later, I think you were in touch with Simon Danchuk, who was then an MP,
Yes,
who wrote a
that's
book
correct.
called Smile for the Camera, and was instrumental in a dispatches programme which you appeared in.
That's correct.
We'll come back to that. In his book, which you may well have read, and we have an excerpt, but I don't think I need to put it up, he talks about this incident being the squealing of tyres as the Special Branch, just out of another programme that the young people won't remember or know about, but called the Sweeney, which I'm sure you do, where police officers seemed to be burning rubber wherever they went. Was it anything like that?
Absolutely not. And
So-
number one, I've never read the book,
Yeah.
and number two, the interaction between the Met Special Branch officers was as I've described, and nothing more dramatic than as I've described.
So if Mr. Danchuk wrote about the squealing of tyres as the Special Branch officers drove into the car park, that's a little dramatic licence he allowed himself the luxury of.
Having, if that's the what was written in the book, I'd say it doesn't reflect what actually happened.
Right. So let's go then, please, to the interview itself. But before I do, let me just ask you about this. At the foot of page 2 of 6, have you got the statement, the last few lines?
Yes.
Having agreed the compromise, they told us, and turning over to the next page, they told us the person we would be interviewing would mention a public figure, and they asked us not to pursue any discussion in relation to that person. Do you remember that now?
Yes, I do.
So they did go a little further. They did say that the name of a public figure might crop up,
Correct.
and it was in relation to that public figure that you were not to ask any questions.
Correct.
Did they tell you who the public figure was?
Absolutely not.
So it's clear that the Special Branch officers knew about the inmate, that they knew the inmate would say something about a public figure, and they knew that you and Mr. Vallis were turning up to interview him, presumably about a murder.
I have to assume that.
Yeah. Having arrived at the compromise and having had the discussions you did the Special Branch officers stay, or did they go, or did you just go into the establishment and leave them behind?
We took our papers and we remember them returning to their car, and they remained in their car until we'd signed in.
And inside the establishment, you remembered being taken to an interview room where the inmate was already waiting to see you. And was there anyone else there that you remembered?
Yes, there was. It's quite normal for a prisoner to elect to have a member of prison staff present. It's his right
Yeah.
during any interview. what did surprise me is, and this is, normally it's a uniform prison officer. In this case, it appeared to be a senior prison officer because I've been thinking about this, and the officer there was in civilian clothes. He wasn't a uniform officer.
He was an assistant governor, perhaps?
That was the assumption we made afterwards.
Did you get his name?
No.
If I gave you the name, can we see if this jogs a memory or not? Either John Bishop or Simon Bishop or Simon John Bishop?
No.
No.
It's too long ago.
All right. So you go through the interview, and Sergeant Vallis, and I'm looking at the third page, the internal pagination of your statement. Sergeant Vallis outlined the reason for your being there, and you say he conducted the proceedings during which it soon became very evident that the prisoner could be eliminated from the inquiry as he'd been in custody at the time of the murder. So that would be a pretty solid alibi, presumably,
Correct.
Mr. Folston. And the continued presence of the prison officer, on reflection, you say must have had some bearing on the subject's alibi, because I did think it was unusual, looking back on it, for the prison officer still to be present during our interview.
Correct.
You say the process took about 10 minutes, and then without further questioning by Sergeant Vallis or yourself, the prisoner launched into a dialogue regarding a relationship he'd had with a member of Parliament named Cyril Smith. So that was completely volunteered by him, out of the blue.
It was completely out of the blue. We'd finished our interview, and he just exploded in this. In this
Well, I'm not going to go through all the graphic detail because there was a bit of it, but can you simply confirm that in your statements he said he appeared to be angry about the fact that despite having had what he thought was an ongoing physical relationship, Smith had dumped him in favour of a younger boy?
Correct.
And as far as this inmate is concerned, in 1976, what was your assessment or knowledge about his age?
He was in his mid-teens because of the type of institution he was in. He would be in his mid-teens.
Which means?
I think he was probably about 16, maybe 17, probably around that sort of age. But
carry on, sorry.
But obviously, no, I'll let you finish. I'm sorry about that.
No, not at all. When was he saying this relationship had existed between him and Smith? How far was he going back?
He appeared to be talking about the immediate time when he was when he was still at large, before he was actually in an institution.
And do you remember now how long he'd been inside at the point you saw him?
I'm afraid I don't.
You said, although clearly if he had been in a sexual relationship with Cyril Smith, there was a possibility it was an exploitative relationship, probably a certainty, but you said in this statement there was no indication that the relationship he claimed to be having was anything other than consensual.
That's absolutely correct. There was no complaint. The very basis of the complaint was that he'd merely been dumped for somebody younger. It would, at no time did he complain about about Smith's conduct per se. No. He complained about the fact he'd been dumped.
And you said we made no attempt to question him regarding these allegations, as this was outside the scope of your inquiries, as well as you were respecting the request made by the special branch officers.
That's correct.
Right. And for the avoidance of doubt, you made clear in this statement that you had no doubt that he was referring to Cyril Smith MP.
Absolutely.
And in 1976, Cyril Smith was an MP.
That's correct.
Yeah. When you left the building, having interviewed him, first of all, how long do you think you'd been there?
Probably no more than about half an hour.
Had the special branch officers gone?
The card left.
And you remembered, I'm looking at the 4th page of your 6-page statement, you remember you and Mr. Vallis sat in a car, debriefed each other about what had happened. And did you say that Andrew, which is a reference, I'm looking at the top, Mr. Falston, of page 4 of 6.
I have it.
Second paragraph. In the car, debriefing each other as to what had occurred in the interview, and Andrew, that's Vallis, decided he'd inform the senior investigating officer about the actions of the special branch officers.
That's correct.
Is that right?
Yes, correct.
And the SIO, was that a Detective Superintendent Brian Remain?
That's correct.
And then you say this, skipping over the next line, because you didn't recall the name of the inmate, and I'm not going to ask you for his name, but you say, I'm sure that the following morning, during the briefing, Andy or I would have recounted the intervention by Special Branch and the allegations regarding Cyril Smith, and then you say the persons likely to have been present and still alive are as follows, and you list them. Brian Warren, Jeff McKinney, Andrew Wise, John Shanahan, Michael Shelton and Philip Busby, all of them detective constables, detective sergeants and 1 detective inspector. And is that a memory, or is that just, when you made this statement in 2015, an assumption that you must have told somebody else about it?
They were members of the inquiry, the murder inquiry, that would normally have been there, particularly Detective Inspector Warren, because he was effectively the resident inspector back at Pangbourne, who was always present during the briefings.
Yeah. Can I invite your attention to the document behind tab 4, and we can put it up on the screen. OHY 005568.
I have it.
And these are the names I've run through because of the fact that these are the names that you mentioned in the 2015 witness statement. And we can see that each of them, without going through them all one by one, but each of them, apart from Mr. Remain, who has since passed away, but each of them who was willing to say anything didn't recall anything like what you remember, apart from Jeff McKinney, who didn't wish to make a statement, but replied by letter. Can you help explain why it might be if you or Mr. Vallis or both of you at the briefing the next morning mentioned this occurrence, that none of them, those who are able to say or have said, don't remember anything like it? It's not something that you're likely to forget, is it, Mr. Ford?
No, I have to differ. We used to sit down in the morning and go through each other's actions. And for example, there was something like about 10 teams working on this, and I can't remember nothing that everyone spoke about their experiences with interviews on the previous day, and I can't remember anything being mentioned by any of those teams either. So it's an awful long time ago, but also we weren't too troubled about what was recounted by the other teams, unless it was relevant to the murder inquiry itself, the direction of the inquiry. So I'm actually not that surprised.
Except, I'm sure you will agree that having a chinwag with other officers about the actions that they've resulted in a murder inquiry is one thing, but being told by an officer that we turned up to interview an inmate about the murder to be confronted by special branch officers saying it was in the national interest not to ask questions about a public figure. And then when you embark on the interview, the inmate launches into a tirade about a sexual relationship with Cyril Smith MP. That's pretty unusual and exceptional and not likely to be forgotten for a long time, don't you think?
The environment we worked under was one of absolute focus.
Mm.
I can actually say that Brian Remain was a very tight boss, and our focus, our entire focus, was the actual murder inquiry itself. And it does sound strange in this environment that we were so focused on the murder inquiry that such a thing was almost an irrelevance.
Yeah. But can I just ask you to look at something you said in your 2015 statement. So it's the one I've been asking you to look at. And if you go, please, to the very last page, page 6 of 6.
I have it.
And the very final paragraph deals with the TV programme in which you appeared. But it's the last two lines, really. It had bothered me over the years that his allegations had been believed by me, but we were not in a position at that time to pursue his complaints. So I think what you're saying is, perhaps tell me if I've misunderstand what that sentence is about. Were you saying that the boy that you saw, the complaint he made, is that what you're talking about?
No, I don't know. That was badly worded by me.
What does it mean?
It means that he'd made a complaint. He may have told his story to others.
Yeah.
And if I can explain my motivation for contacting Simon Danczek's office,
Yeah.
was that shortly after Smith's death, his brother appeared in the news.
That's Norman Smith.
I presume so.
Yeah.
His brother appeared, and I can remember him saying there is no evidence to support these allegations that are being made.
Yeah.
And it was at that point I remember that because the Pangborg murder was never detected, the files to a murder inquiry are never destroyed, and I had hoped that if I recounted this, then there would be some evidence to support what was my experience.
So it was it an appearance on television by the brother or something you read in the papers? You said both things in both statements. Nobody's going to criticise you for that, but what do you remember?
I just remember I was somewhat angered by his statement to say there's no proof of what's been said.
Yeah. So you hoped, it having been a murder inquiry, that the officers that you thought you'd mention it to in the briefing may have recorded what you told them, or that
not the officers. I'd hoped that there'd be some documentary evidence in the action that we'd completed, or there'd be some note that was still existing on the file.
Right. Well, we can actually look, and that's a good, as it were, segue, Mr. Folston, into the action. Can we put up, please, on the screen, IPC 000862. You've actually got a paper copy, I suspect, Mr. Folston, in your file. Let me just see if I can find it behind tab 8. Tab 8. And you'll see that there is one of our inquiry references at the bottom, OHY 005569. Can you see where it finds where you see the pagination 003? It's up on, it's the third page, please.
Oh.
Oh, forgive me, I've given the wrong reference. It's OHY, it's my fault, OHY 005569, page 3. I gave the wrong reference. Now, here's the action. If you look on the screen, Mr. Forster, you might find it easier.
Yes.
And can you see that that's a Thames Valley action sheet? Can you see the number? It's 1033 on the right-hand side. And the action was originally given to officers by the name of Busby and Shanahan, which are two of the names we saw of those you thought you might have mentioned it to at the briefing the next day.
Correct.
But clearly, it was you and Mr. Vallis who were asked to take up this action, not them.
Correct.
Nature of inquiry, please interview and obtain statement from below named who was an absconder from H.M. Borstal, Feltham, and some dates are given in 1976. And his name is given, but it's been redacted and ciphered. And at the bottom it was resulted, see statement of WM A12. That's our inquiry cipher for the name of the inmate you saw, and Sergeant Vallis. And we can see the date is the 19th of May 1976, which by the work that's been done by the IOPC is the date, it appears, on which you went to interview this inmate at Feltham. Now, if we go to the next page under the same reference, hard to read, but we're looking at, and perhaps it can be blown up a bit. This is the statement referred to that Detective Sergeant Vallis made, and we can see the date of it at the foot of the page is the 19th of May, 1976. The date's on, it's right at the bottom, just momentarily, we can see the date, so that's the date you went. Signed Andrew Vallis, and if we can go back to the substance of it again to the top. And you see it refers to action number 1033, so we've closed the circle. Yes. The action number was 1033, it refers to the statement Mr. Vallis made, and this is the statement. And it reads, at 11 o'clock on the 19th of May 1976, with Temporary Detective Constable Falston, I interviewed, born, and I think we can just about make out the year of birth, 57. 57, do you think, Greg? 1957. So in 1976, he would have been about 19.
Yes.
At Feltham, he failed to return from leave to the Borstal and was at large until some date in 1976. There was nothing in our interview to suggest he could be connected in any way with the murder of Jack Wood. He was a homosexual, and it proved impossible to tie him down to exact whereabouts / addresses. Now, two things. There's nothing about an alibi. Do you remember you told us that the assistant governor or the prison officer who was in the interview with him said it couldn't be him because
Sorry, I don't think I said it was the prison officer.
Who said it?
I thought from our action, there was something in the discussion we had that put him outside the scope of our investigation.
Just to remind you, what you said in the 2015 statement is Mr. Vallis outlined the reason for your attendance. That was in the course of the interview, and he conducted the proceedings during which it soon became very evident that the prisoner could be eliminated from the inquiry as he'd been in custody at the time of the murder. The continued presence of the prison officer on reflection must have had some bearing on the subject's alibi, because I did think it was unusual looking back on it for the prison officer still to be present during our interview. So it looks as if the fact that he had an alibi, and his alibi was he was in custody, was made apparent during the course of the interview, and somehow, and we'll look at this in another way shortly, the prison officer who was present had some bearing on that discovery.
No.
It doesn't. You don't think that's what you're saying?
I don't agree with that. So, if I conveyed that impression, that's
No.
wrong.
So where did it come from, the alibi?
I assumed over the because there was something in the discussion we had that made both Sergeant Pallas and I come to the conclusion he could be eliminated from our inquiry. And that, probably during that 2015 interview,
Yeah.
in the absence of having this information now, but I remember quite clearly, we came to the conclusion he didn't even know, one of the things that stand out, he didn't even know where Oxfordshire was. And there was something that came up during the interview that made it very clear to us that he could be eliminated as a suspect, but because of the passage of time, I can't remember what caused us to reach those conclusions.
I thought you'd agreed earlier that it was because he was in custody at the time, or not?
That was one of the assumptions one would make.
Right.
There was something that was very clear cut that enabled us to eliminate him.
All right.
I'm very sorry that I can't remember that, but there was something. We didn't have any problem whatsoever in saying that's one we can tick off the list.
Yeah.
The reasons for that I can't help you with.
All right. We'll come back to that in another guise, probably after our break. But can we put the document back up on the screen, please? And the second paragraph of Mr. Vallis's statement, where he says he was a homosexual, proved impossible to tie him down to exact whereabouts or addresses. How was Mr. Vallis in a position to make a statement like that, a sort of general statement, but nothing to do with Cyril Smith or any of the information and the anger which he exhibited during the course of the interview, as you've described it in your 2015 interview statement?
I can't answer that.
It's not complete, is it?
No.
And it makes no mention of the special branch occurrence.
No.
But would
I
you
had hoped it would,
Yeah.
but it obviously didn't.
Would you expect an evidential statement like this, though, to include the occurrence of special branch officers turning up?
Possibly not.
No. If we go back to the action on the previous page, likewise, there's absolutely no mention of special branch officers turning up and the occurrence that you've mentioned. Do you agree with that, Mr.
I do.
Forster? And there's no reason why in an internal police document that couldn't have been entered on in the results section of the action sheet, is there?
We took it in turns to complete the action sheets,
Yeah.
and if I'd had completed it, I would have.
Can you think of any reason why Sergeant Vallis, he after all was angry that he was being spoken down to and told what he could and couldn't ask this individual? Can you explain why it might be Mr. Vallis didn't enter those details, that information on this action sheet?
Without being flippant, I suspect that knowing Chief Superintendent Romain well, Brian Romain may have dismissed that as an irrelevance, and you should keep your focus on the inquiry we're currently on and stop mentioning irrelevance.
But is it likely that Mr. Romain would have intervened in order to prevent that information being entered onto the action sheet?
No, absolutely not.
No.
But Andrew Vallis, having worked with Brian Romain before, may have kept the information he was putting down strictly to the terms of our brief.
Yeah.
And his experience may have led him to believe that adding things such as that wouldn't be approved of.
Yeah. Chair, I'm going to be a while longer, not too much, but I'm not going to finish within the next 5 or 10 minutes. So if you'd like to take your break now, and we'll finish with Mr. Falston, if that's all right with you. shortly afterwards.
Yes, we'll return at 3:30.
Would everybody please now take their seats? Proceedings will resume very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we put back up on screen OHY 005569 at page 5. Now this is very tricky to read, Mr. Falston, but this is the statement of the inmate that you visited. You can see, in fact, he gave his age as 18 at the time. And I'm not going to read through all of it, but if we go towards the bottom, the last substantive line, I cannot remember where I was on the 2nd or the 3rd of March 1976. So does that give us a clue to the period which you were interested in?
Yes.
And then over the page, but I was in London, in the London area. I have never been to Reading, never even heard of Pangbourne. I've not heard of a bookmaker, and the name is given. I know a man whose name is redacted who works for a car hire firm. He is gay. I spent quite a bit of time with him. I've stayed at his flat several times. Detective Sergeant Lloyd of Vine Street Police Station, possibly Vice Squad, knows me, and I gave him information about the gay scene. I have known him a couple of years, and then there's something which can't be deciphered. I used an alias while I was on the run, and most people knew me as, and then there's something else which is difficult to read. And signed, it's dated the 19th of May, and it's countersigned by Mr. Vallis. So it rather suggests that that statement was taken from him during the course of your visit.
Correct.
He mentions the gay scene in London, but makes no mention of Cyril Smith in this statement. Can you explain that omission?
No.
Is it something that should have appeared there, do you think?
No, because the outburst appeared to come after we'd completed our business. They appeared to be two quite compartmentally. This business was complete,
Including the statement?
including the statement, and this appeared to just follow on.
I see. Now, you mentioned a little earlier why it was you approached Simon Danchuk. Up to that point in time, and after this occurrence in 1976, did it ever occur to you that you ought to report this to any of the independent bodies that regulate police?
Not at all.
Because just didn't enter your head, you've forgotten it, or it didn't matter, or what?
The relevance of it was long forgotten. I met Andrew Vallis several times. He retired from the police and become head of Shell Security, and I was in industry when we met quite frequently until his death, and we never actually even discussed it again.
Right. So it just wasn't an issue?
Was never on the radar again.
And so, as you said a little earlier, the reason it came to the fore again was Cyril Smith's brother saying there was nothing to prove the allegations, and as far as you were concerned, there was something, is what this boy had told you.
I had hoped there'd be something on the documentation of the Pangbourne murder that would prove Smith's brother incorrect.
But we've looked at what there is, and there's nothing to help, is there?
Absolutely not.
No. And I think you recalled contacting Simon Danchuk in 2012, 2013?
That would be correct.
Yeah. And you contacted his office, I think, by email, but for reasons you've just given, you didn't report this to anybody else in the intervening years.
It was only all that prompted my reporting it was this statement to say there's nothing to be proven, that nobody's got any evidence, and I just thought, no, you're wrong. There's just a possibility that incident is recorded somewhere.
And you agreed to go on the dispatches programme.
I did.
That went out, if my memory serves me, I think on the 12th of September 2013. And you gave a full interview, I think, to the production team, but they didn't put all of it out during the broadcast. Is that correct? So there was only a limited part of your interview that actually went up on the documentary.
That's right.
And we have a clip here, Mr. Falston. Let's remind you of what you said. It should be. Oh, you've got it. That's fine.
It was now.
And presumably you stand by that, Mr. Falston.
I do.
Protecting Cyril Smith, not investigating him.
I do.
Help us with one other feature of the programme. During the course of the making of it, did you meet a man called Tony Robinson?
I did.
And he was a former Special Branch officer.
He was a former Special Branch inspector.
Inspector. And when you spoke, did he say to you that Special Branch would flag inmates in custody?
I was always, since the incident, I'd always wondered how the mechanism worked whereby an inmate could be flagged, would result in the meeting we had with Special Branch, and he viewed it as quite a normal process and explained just how it happened and how they could do it.
So that was a normal occurrence to flag inmates who may have or be of interest to Special Branch and their remit?
Correct.
Yeah. And that would explain at least why they turned up at the time they did on the day that you and Mr. Vallis were going to interview this inmate.
Correct.
Final subject I'd like you to help us with, please, relates to a report, an IOPC report, Operation Sycamore, behind tab 6. It's a draft report only, although the conclusions, I think, are unlikely to change. Have you had an opportunity of reading that, Mr. Forster?
No, I haven't. I've made a point of not doing any pre-reading, whether like that.
Okay, but let's see how we go. If we can put it up on screen, it's IPC, there we are, 000862, and go to page 7, paragraph 41. We'll need more than that, perhaps the whole section, please, down to 43. Now, the investigators for Operation Sycamore, amongst other things, they spoke, in fact, it was Operation Clifton, which was, in general terms, a remit to look into allegations about Cyril Smith, and it was an operation conducted by Greater Manchester Police. And in relation to this individual, clearly now an adult, or they spoke to him on 2 successive days in November 2014, as we can see in paragraph 41, on the second day of which, having interviewed him, they took a witness statement. And we can see in paragraph 42 that he confirmed he was an inmate at the relevant establishment, and he was there around 1975, although he couldn't confirm the exact dates. And this is what he had to say. While I was in Feltham, I was visited by 2 police detectives from Thames Valley Police who informed me that they were working on a murder inquiry. As I was a minor, I was interviewed by the 2 detectives in the presence of Mr. John Bishop, in brackets Assistant Governor. I was asked about the murder, and they asked where I was on a particular date. I can't remember what this date was. Mr. Bishop, who was present, answered the question and confirmed that I was actually in custody at Feltham Borstal, and that was the end of the interview. So what he was saying is that the prison officer by the name of Bishop, who was present, is the one who alibied him.
That would explain why Andrew Vallis and I did. Thank you for filling in that gap.
Except that in his witness statement, he tends to suggest that at the time of the murder, which if it is the 2nd or 3rd of March 1976, that he might have been on the run. So it's slightly confusing.
Yes.
But certainly what he was telling Operation Clifton in 2014 is that it was Mr. Bishop who confirmed he was in custody and therefore had a rock-solid alibi. And he went on to state, if you go back please to paragraph 42, as soon as the interview concluded, the 2 police detectives promptly left. I definitely did not have a conversation in relation to Mr. Cyril Smith at all with the police officers. I can categorically say I have never met Cyril Smith whilst I was living in London or had any kind of relationship with him at all. I do know of Mr. Cyril Smith as an MP, but that's as far as it goes. And then paragraph 43, to complete what he had to say, in the record of interview with him, the Operation Clifton officers said that he was probed and questioned at length regarding his rent boy lifestyle in London and the interview at Feltham Borstal, but at no time did he mention Cyril Smith. So you can see on the face of that, Mr. Folston, all these years after, there's a direct conflict between what you've told us and what he told the Operation Clifton officers. And what's your take on that?
The officers spoke to me because just prior to interviewing the person, they said they traced him. Was there anything else that I could remember that may help them?
Yeah.
And they spoke to me afterwards and said it was a complete denial.
Yeah.
And my response to that was, I've discharged my responsibility. I've said what I heard, and it actually gave me a great feeling of release, because I'd conveyed what I'd heard, and he claimed that it hadn't happened, but I'd discharged my responsibility. So I actually came away feeling an immense feeling of release.
Yeah. And does this link with that last sentence of your 25th statement, 2015, about what had bothered you for all of those years? Right. Not the end of the story, I'm afraid, because Mr. Bishop, the erstwhile Assistant Governor, was spoken to. If you look at paragraph 44 and 45, he was spoken to in February the following year, 2015, by Operation Clifton. A record of interview was taken and a statement obtained. Paragraph 45, he confirmed that he was employed at Feltham as an Assistant Governor, retired July 89, states he returned to Feltham Borstal for a brief period before moving to Maidstone in the autumn of 76, recalled an inmate at Feltham making allegations against MP Cyril Smith. In his statement he said, I recall one inmate specifically who complained many times that he had witnessed occasions where Cyril Smith MP and others held homosexual and physically abusive sessions, and who even, over the page please, page 8, claims that someone had been killed at one of these sessions. However, he didn't name any other names or give more data to me. Mr. Bishop reported these allegations to P4, which is now known as the Ministry of Justice. He also recalled, I can't remember exactly how contact was made to the police, either by P4 or myself, but as a result, and note these words, a Scotland Yard detective, and that's not what you were Thames Valley. As a result, a Scotland Yard detective came and interviewed the inmate, who I believe had the surname Foley. I was not present during the interview and heard nothing further from the police, P4 or the authorities. Paragraph 47, I believe these allegations were made between 1972 and 1976, but I can't be certain. Whilst at Felton Borstal, I was the only serving staff member with the name Bishop. The inmate, who I believe was called Foley, was the only person who made specific allegations about Cyril Smith. Paragraph 48, in his interview, Operation Clifton officers comment the description and personality of the inmate, Foley, is entirely consistent with that of, and that's the cipher for the inmate that you actually interviewed with Mr. Vallis, WMA12, who states that when he was interviewed by Thames Valley Police in relation to a murder inquiry, he states a Mr. John Bishop, Assistant Governor, was present during the interview, and it was the prison officer who was able to alibi him, who apparently had been in custody at the time. Operation Clifton made inquiries to trace Foley through police records and others which proved negative, and Operation Winterkey, which is the overarching police investigation into these allegations, were also unable to trace any records concerning presumably him. So we have the conundrum that we have the Assistant Governor by the name of Bishop, the only bishop in the establishment at the time, who says that he was not present during any interview with Foley at all, certainly not one of the description that you give, and that the only person he remembers saying anything about Cyril Smith made multiple complaints about Smith to him, which he reported up to the Ministry of Justice as it was, and as a result of which a Scotland Yard detective came along to interview him, but he took no part in it. Don't suppose you're going to be able to help, are you?
Not at all.
No. But you can see, granted it's after all of these years, but you can see when Operation Clifton took your account to both the inmate himself and the man who was present, although you don't name him, but a complete blank is drawn. And so the result of all of that is, if we go to page 9 of this report, and it will go up on screen, Mr. Folston, but at page 9 you have the hard copy, right at the bottom, analysis of the evidence. Mr. Folston alleged that the intervention by the 2 Metropolitan Police Special Branch officers in the Thames Valley Police murder investigation was an attempt to cover up child sexual abuse committed by Smith. And over to the next page, please. Paragraph 58 in his original statement made to Clifton officers, WMA12 stated he didn't have a conversation with the 2 officers about Cyril Smith, never met him while he was living in London, and never had any kind of relationship with him, but just knew him as a Member of Parliament. That was it. And then 59, Bishop, Assistant Governor, who according to the inmates was present when he was interviewed by the officers, and you confirmed somebody was present, does not recall WMA12 making any allegations against Smith. And Bishop does remember, however, an inmate making allegations against Smith, but believes his name to be Foley, and Mr. Bishop believes the allegations from Foley were passed by him to the Ministry of Justice and then to the police, although he can't be certain. But to the extent he was, he said it was a Scotland Yard detective. And then paragraph 60, they make the point that you provided names of Thames Valley officers who were on the same investigation and were likely to recall you or Mr. Vallis mentioning the special branch intervention, and you've seen that those who were spoken to and prepared to speak had no recollection of it. So unhappily, it's all unverifiable. But Mr. Folston, when we come back to you, and the panel have seen you and can assess you, as far as you're concerned, it absolutely happened.
It did.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's all I have to ask you, and I'll see if the chair and panel have any questions.
No, we have no questions. Thank you.
There we are. Thank you very much, Mr. Folston, for coming. Chair, there are a couple of statements which Mr. Henderson is going now formally to adduce.
Chair, you will recall yesterday during Commander Roper's evidence, you heard about an operation called Operation Larch, which was carried out by the Metropolitan Police Department of Professional Standards. We have obtained a statement from Miss Sue Simpson, who was the person who made the allegation in that case. And if we could bring them up, the witness statement we have from her is MPS 003528. There we go. Miss Simpson is a retired police officer. She was posted to Bow Street Police Station between 1979 and 1984, and she recalls being told in an informal way by colleagues in the early 1980s that an operation investigating male prostitution in and around Piccadilly Circus had been stopped because high-profile people were involved. She's now aware, having given this information to the Operation Larch team and to the inquiry, that operation was Operation Circus. And in this statement she gives her account of what she heard. You'll of course see, Chair, the links between this and the other evidence you've heard today. So we'd ask you to formally adduce that statement, and again it will be published on the inquiry website. And we'll also add the original statement given by her to Operation Larch. That's OHY 005521. So no need to bring that one up. Thank you, Chair. That's all for now.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson.
Chair, that's all the evidence for today. Tomorrow, Mr. Sinclair, Mr. Holmes, who you heard mention of today, an officer from Wiltshire Police, and Commander Jerome.
Thank you, Mr. Altman.